The most expensive thing you will ever buy is a lie you tell to yourself. Look at him. This is Mint. Mint is 32 years old. He holds a title that took him 8 years of 70-hour work weeks, missed birthdays, and chronic sleep deprivation to acquire Senior Director of Strategy. He makes $165,000 a year. He lives in a high-rise apartment in a zip code perfectly engineered to signal upward mobility. He drives a German performance sedan with a matte black finish. He drinks single-origin pour-over coffee that costs $8 a cup, poured by a barista who knows him by name. If you asked anyone in his office, anyone in his family, or anyone looking at his carefully curated digital footprint, they would tell you that Mint has arrived. He is the blueprint of modern success. He is the guy who made it out of the middle-class grind and into the stratosphere. But the blueprint is a forgery. Because if you look past the tailored mint green jacket, if you look past the quartz countertops, the leather steering wheel, and the corner office with the panoramic view, you will find a balance sheet that is quietly, desperately bleeding to death. Mint's net worth is a negative number. He is mathematically insolvent. He is operating month to month, paycheck to paycheck, surviving on the razor's edge of his bi-weekly direct deposit. The question we need to ask isn't how he spends his money. The math of lifestyle creep is incredibly simple. You make more, you spend more. You upgrade the car, you upgrade the zip code, you upgrade the wine. The real question, the dark, uncomfortable question, is why? Why does a highly intelligent, highly educated corporate strategist voluntarily chain himself to a life of financial suffocation? Society will tell you it's about status. They will tell you Mint buys these things to show off to his coworkers, to flex on social media, to make his neighbors jealous. They will call it keeping up with the Joneses and dismiss him as vain. But society fundamentally misunderstands the psychology of the trap. Mint isn't buying a luxury car to convince the world that he is successful. Mint is buying a luxury car to convince himself. He is trapped in an invisible psychological prison called identity economics. Every single day, Mint walks into a glass tower filled with people who are older, wealthier, and seemingly more confident than he is. Deep down, in the quiet, unlit spaces of his own mind, Mint feels like an absolute imposter. He feels like a 22-year-old kid who somehow sneaked into the boardroom while the adults weren't looking. He suffers from a chronic, low-grade professional anxiety that hums in the background of his life like a bad refrigerator. When he sits in a high-stakes strategy meeting, his pulse races. When his vice president asks him a question he doesn't immediately know the answer to, a cold sweat pricks the back of his neck. He feels incomplete. He feels incompetent. He feels like at any moment the world is going to figure out that he doesn't actually belong here. So, he buys armor. That $165,000 title came with an invisible uniform. And Mint truly believes that if he just wears the uniform, the imposter syndrome will finally disappear. He leases the $900 a month car because he tells his subconscious, a fraud wouldn't drive this car. I drive this car, therefore I must be a real executive. He rents the $3,500 a month apartment because he tells his subconscious, a failure wouldn't live in this building. I live here, therefore I must be a success. He isn't showing off, he is self-medicating. Every swipe of the credit card, every signature on a lease, every reservation at a Michelin star restaurant is a desperate, expensive attempt to purchase the identity he is terrified he doesn't actually possess. To understand the depth of Mint's trap, we have to stop looking at his bank statements and start looking at his biology. Behavioral economists call this phenomenon self-signaling. Most people assume that our identities dictate our actions. We think, I am a successful person, therefore I buy nice things. But the human brain actually works in reverse. We observe our own actions to figure out who we are. It is 11:45 p.m. on a Thursday. Mint is exhausted after a brutal 14-hour shift. He was chewed out by a client, his presentation was torn apart by the board, and his ego is bruised. His brain is entirely depleted of serotonin. It is desperately searching for evidence of its own worth. He opens his laptop. He logs onto an e-commerce site. He adds a $1,200 Italian espresso machine to his cart, an appliance he does not need and barely knows how to use. He clicks Buy Now. Why? Because the physical act of spending $1,200 on a Tuesday night without checking his checking account balance sends a powerful biological signal back to his own brain. It says, only a wealthy, highly secure person can afford to be this careless with capital. You just did this. Therefore, you are wealthy and secure. For exactly 3 seconds after the confirmation screen loads, his brain floods with synthetic dopamine. The anxiety vanishes. The imposter syndrome dissolves. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, he feels exactly like the character he is playing. But the dopamine evaporates by morning. The espresso machine arrives 3 days later, and it is just metal and plastic sitting on a quartz counter. The void returns. The anxiety creeps back in. And now, he is $1,200 poorer, which only increases his baseline stress, requiring an even larger purchase to numb the pain the next time. This is the Imposter Syndrome Tax. It is the most brutal, unforgiving tax in the modern economy because it scales infinitely with your income. If Mint gets promoted to vice president next year and makes $250,000, his anxiety will not decrease. It will multiply. The stakes will be higher. He will be in rooms with billionaires and seasoned industry veterans. He will feel like an even bigger imposter. And so, the uniform must become more expensive to compensate. The $900 car lease will become a $1,500 car lease. The $4,000 watch will be traded in for a $12,000 watch. The vacations will upgrade from domestic flights to international first class. He is a hostage to his own aesthetic. The psychological weight of maintaining this avatar is crushing him. Mint spends 8 hours a day managing the strategy of a multi-million-dollar corporation, and he spends his remaining 16 hours managing the perception of himself. He is terrified of downsizing. If he sells the luxury car and buys a used, reliable Honda, his brain will immediately register it as a failure. If he moves out of the luxury high-rise and into a modest walk-up, he will have to look in the mirror every morning and admit that the executive was just a costume. The human ego is a fragile, dangerous thing. It would rather go completely bankrupt. It would rather drown in high-interest consumer debt than face the cognitive dissonance of admitting it cannot afford the character it is playing. The collapse of an identity rarely happens in a boardroom. It doesn't happen during a dramatic argument. It happens in the quiet, liminal spaces of our lives. It is a Tuesday evening. Mint is standing alone in the elevator of his luxury apartment building. The doors are closed. The walls are mirrored from floor to ceiling. He looks at himself. He looks at the vibrant mint green jacket. He looks at the heavy mechanical watch. He looks at the pristine, polished leather shoes. And for the very first time in his life, he doesn't see a successful executive looking back at him. He sees an actor who is trapped on a stage he can't afford, completely exhausted, reciting lines he didn't write, for an audience of exactly one. He walks out of the elevator. He unlocks his apartment. He sits down on his $5,000 designer couch. He pulls out his phone, opens his banking app, and looks at the single number that defines his current reality. $412. That is his total liquid cash. One emergency, one missed paycheck, one corporate layoff away from total ruin. In that exact moment, the pain of maintaining the lie finally exceeds the pain of the truth. Mint realizes that his money isn't disappearing because he lacks financial discipline. His money is disappearing because his identity requires constant financial subsidization. To build wealth, Mint does not need a better budget spreadsheet. Mint does not need to clip coupons. Mint does not need a side hustle. Mint needs an ego death. The next morning, the rebirth begins. Mint makes a conscious, violent decision to separate his self-worth from his consumption. He decides that he is no longer the senior director of strategy. That is just a mechanical task he performs to acquire capital from a corporation. He creates a new identity, the architect. An architect doesn't need to look wealthy. An architect doesn't care about the paint on the walls or the badge on the car. An architect only cares about the structural integrity of the machine. Mint calls the dealership. He breaks the lease on the luxury German sedan. He pays the exorbitant early termination penalty out of the last remnants of his savings. He takes an Uber to a used car lot and buys a 5-year-old, reliable, unglamorous car in cash. When he drives it to work the next day and parks it next to the sleek sports cars of his colleagues, his heart pounds. His brain screams at him, "You look like a failure. Everyone is going to know you are struggling." He tightens his grip on the steering wheel. He lets the anxiety wash over him. He doesn't fight it. He breathes through it. And then, miraculously, the anxiety disappears. Because he knows the math. That single ego-destroying decision just freed up $1,100 a month in permanent, recurring cash flow. He doesn't stop there. He breaks the lease on the luxury high-rise. He finds a quiet, older apartment in a neighborhood that nobody brags about living in. The rent is exactly half the price. He sells the $1,200 espresso machine. He sells the designer watches. His coworkers notice. Of course they notice. They whisper in the break room. They assume he made a bad trade. They assume he is going through a midlife crisis. They assume he is failing. Mint lets them whisper. He realizes that other people's opinions are just a luxury tax on your freedom, and he simply refuses to pay it anymore. Mint is no longer spending money to convince himself he is successful. He is hoarding capital to buy his way out of the system entirely. He routes his newly reclaimed $3,000 a month directly into broad market index funds and a high-yield treasury ladder. He stops checking the mirror. He starts checking the compounding interest. Every time his capital grows, his biological brain receives a new kind of signal. It isn't the cheap, synthetic dopamine of buying a shiny object or a new piece of clothing. It is the deep, structural serotonin of pure security. He looks at his portfolio and his brain says, "You are untouchable." 3 years pass. Mint is 35. He still works in the exact same glass tower. He still sits at the exact same boardroom table. But the power dynamic has fundamentally shifted. The vice president attempts to pressure him during a meeting, threatening bonuses if targets aren't hit. The other directors, who are still trapped in their $1,500 car leases, who are still suffocating under the weight of their own imposter syndrome tax, sweat and nod anxiously. Mint does not sweat. Mint does not need to wear the armor anymore. He looks at the VP with cold, quiet confidence. Because Mint knows that if he was fired today, right now, in this very room, his portfolio could sustain his deeply optimized lifestyle for the next decade without him ever lifting a finger. He is the most dangerous person in the room because he is the only person who doesn't actually need to be there. The trap is not the economy. The trap is not inflation. The trap is the character you are forcing yourself to play. The moment you kill the character, you take back your life. Are you buying assets? Or are you just buying props for a play that nobody is actually watching? The math is waiting for your answer. Subscribe. Don't forget to like and share this video. I'll see you at the next level.